Hi everybody, my name is Abraham Saivisi, and this is the video for defect number 3762, previous and next properties does not work. So if we take a look at the card as it's defined on Mingle, we'll see that the steps to reproduce is to go to BreazeHome.com, go to results page by clicking on or browse all properties near Miami, Florida. Go to the detail page of a property by clicking on a property in the results page. Click on previous property or next property links at the top right. Expected results is that it should take you to the previous and next property according to what was presented to the results page. The actual result is that it takes you to a different location / anchor on the detail page. So let's see how it looks on the actual production server. We'll see that if we actually click this button, wait till it loads. Once the properties load, I can click on an individual property and it takes me to the detail page. In the detail page, we have these previous and next property links that should take me accordingly to the previous property, to the next property in the results page. But instead, upon clicking, they don't do anything, or they just take me to another anchor on the page. And instead, if we take a look at the local environment, after we've implemented the modification, the addressal of that defect, we can click here. We wait for it to load. And we can see here that, for example, if we click on this card, of which the previous address is 640 and the next one is 251, just to make sure that we get it in the proper sequence. So we wait for it to load. This is the 531. Then we can go to previous property. We wait for it to load. It takes us to the 641, which was the one before it. Then we can go back to our property. We'll wait for it to load. And we see that we're back to our address, and then we can click next. And it'll go to the address that was after that one. Now, the thing that I did do, that I implemented here, is that we only really should have the previous and next properties when the detail page shows up as a consequence from having been clicked on a results from the results page, right? Because that way we have an array of possible properties that are in sequence, and then we can appropriately select the previous property or next property. But when a person accesses this link by itself without having first come through the results page, so I set it up so that there is no previous and next property buttons, because it wouldn't make any sense, because it's not part of a greater list of properties that would have been the case had we access this property through the results page or through a specific query that arrives at the results page. So that sums up the actual presentation of the fix and addressal of the defect. So if we change it, we take a look at the modifications that we did to the code base. So basically, the main one was here in the detail controller, of which I created all of these functions. So navigate to adjacent property takes as a parameter how many, an integer that describes how many adjacent positions, whether positive or negatives, relative to the current property we want to navigate onto, so that the next shortcut just calls the navigate to adjacent property +1. So that means a positive offset of 1, meaning the next property in the list, and the previous one takes -1, which is the previous property in the list. And the display shortcut is basically a Boolean function that tells us whether this function, rather the arrival at the detail page, is a result of having been on the results page first or not. So that one of the other changes that we made is that we modified the results controller so that actually when we press on the click card, this function is called when we actually click on one of the properties listed, it actually stores the loaded property into rootscope.properties, so that later in the detail page, we check to see if this setting is checked, it is set, if this field is set. And if it is, so then it tells us that we came from the results page and we have the properties loaded in there. And if it's not, then it tells us that we didn't come from the results page, and so we don't have the properties, and so we shouldn't be able to display the shortcut, and that's why this boolean is always called before we actually proceed to navigate to the JSON property. Besides for that, we also modified the detail view and basically added the angular if, which means that we only really display the previous and next shortcut if the display shortcut comes up as true, the function that we've just described. Besides for that, we encountered one problem really, which was the map. It relates to leaflets, to the leaflet plugin that we use, and the way that maps are loaded. Basically, for whatever reason, we couldn't, because it's a static, basically dependency injection that runs throughout the application. If we loaded maps with the same name, it caused us problems. So after a lot of debugging, actually, I came to this solution, which is basically to store all of the, list of maps that we have loaded. And when it comes time to change detail page from one property to the next, we call clear maps. And what clear maps does is it removes each of the individual div element that corresponds to the map, so that the map isn't loaded already and they can be properly reloaded. It's just basically a solution that I had to implement for the problem at hand. And so clear maps is actually called from details page. It's at the end of navigate to JSON property. So before we actually leave the details page, we clear the maps, and that entails removing the actual components of the DOM related to that map, and that way we're able to reload it fresh, which otherwise it wouldn't allow us. So that's basically the gist of the changes made to the code base. And that sums up our presentation of this defect. So this is the results team contact information. Our product owner is Dr. Masood Sajadi, and any questions could be addressed to him. Thank you so much for watching.